So this weekend we celebrate one of the greatest civil rights leaders of all times, someone who changed the face of our nation for good. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would have been 94 years old today if James Earl Ray had not gunned him down April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. You know, just recently, Barbara Walters died. And I always like to reflect on the fact that Barbara Walters and Dr. King and Anne Frank were all born in the same year, in 1929, and yet based on their circumstances, their race, their culture, they led very different lives. One was killed as a teenage girl in a Nazi concentration camp. One was gunned down in Memphis, Tennessee at the age of 38. And one would live to be 89, to be a trailblazer in women's media, but she got to live a whole life. They all lived full lives, they just ended very differently. So in 1986, this federal holiday, Dr. Martin Luther King Day, was created to commemorate the life of this nonviolent, justice-seeking leader. But there was another Black leader who had an equally profound impact on our nation, whom history doesn't remember so kindly. Malcolm X was born May 19, 1925, as Malcolm Little. Whereas Martin was known for his staunch, nonviolent civil disobedience tactics, Malcolm was known for his blunt calling out of white complicity in keeping people of color oppressed, and his gospel of separation from the white society. The press loved to portray these two men as being diametrically opposed and enemies of one another, but in reality, they were fond of one another, according to theologian James Cone, who wrote of the two in his book, Martin and Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare. Although their tactics were different, they both saw each other as fighting for the same thing, freedom for African Americans. And though their tactics were just different, they both came from African American protest traditions. Martin was speaking from the integration perspective, and Malcolm from the nationalist African identity perspective. Each of these perspectives have their roots in the post-slavery era. Frederick Douglass, for example, was a staunch integrationist, and Nat Turner, a staunch nationalist. So Martin and Malcolm come from a long line of African Americans before them, advocating freedom for Blacks in different ways. History often wants to paint Malcolm X as a race baiter, a troublemaker, whose violent past never left him. But in reality, both he and Martin Luther King were products of their environments. King was raised in a loving, stable home in the South where legal racism was evident everywhere. Malcolm X was raised in Lansing, Michigan, where his father was killed when he was only 6 years old. His widowed mom struggled to raise the 7 children on her own, and Malcolm took to stealing food to help the family. He lived in the North, where there weren't signs saying whites only, but where the institutionalized racism kept the African American communities in ghettos of poverty. He saw the indifferent, brutal injustice of police brutality. Dr. King looked to his deeply held Christian values that taught all people were children of God, loved equally by God. And based on this, he firmly believed that the white Christians would see the injustice of racism as they practiced their faith, and of course would support the Southern Freedom Movement. And of course, he was wrong about that. we see that today too, don't we? We may have even said the same thing over the past several years. Surely those who are Christians will reject the atrocities coming out of the White House when Trump was in office, right? Because they go so deeply against the grain of the Christian faith. And yet we see that white evangelicals overwhelmingly voted for Trump. So like King, we too are faced with realization that for many white Christians, they prefer the power of their privilege over the teachings of Jesus. But King persisted in his integrationist approach for most of his life. Malcolm X living off of his wits, drug running, being a pimp, getting busted for a robbery ring that landed him in jail with an 8 to 10 year prison sentence, didn't have that Christian base. But in prison, he learned of a new branch of Islam called the Black Muslims, led by Elijah Muhammad, who claimed to be the anointed leader of Allah. Having seen how African Americans were rendered powerless in the North, this religion appealed to Malcolm X because it uplifted the power of Black people and the power of Black voices. And so he became Elijah's most devoted disciple. He spent his time in the prison library, and when he was released, he became a prophet of nationalism, of proclaiming Blacks could only be free if they lived separately from whites. He said he couldn't claim the title American because he didn't have the freedoms and rights of one. He said, if I sit at the table where you're eating and I don't have any food, I am not a diner. That doesn't make me a diner. Whereas Martin called on the benevolent justice of a God who loved all, Malcolm and his dream included Black and white children playing together. Malcolm said very clearly that whites were the devils taking humanity away from people of color. Martin was surprised by the whites' non-involvement. Malcolm expected nothing more from the whites. But each was speaking in a language that could be understood and made sense to their audiences. Martin had been speaking for Southern Blacks where they couldn't sit at a counter. Malcolm had been speaking for ghettoized Northern Blacks who were kept in the cycle of poverty and couldn't afford to sit at a counter. It wasn't a case of who was right or wrong, though the media tried to portray Martin as a kinder, gentler integrationist and Malcolm as a nationalist to be feared, although they actually influenced each other profoundly. In 1964, Malcolm X broke with the Black Muslims after learning of Elijah Muhammad's inability to keep his pants up. And as he left that restrictive movement, he began to open up to more, to move more towards Martin's point of view. In his bullet or ballot speech in 1964, Malcolm said, speaking about Dr. King, I'm not for separation, you're not for integration. What you and I are here for is freedom. Who knows where his theology would have evolved if he had lived longer? Sadly, he was gunned down by 3 members of the Black Muslims February 21st, 1965, just a year short of leaving that sect. But Martin was also evolving and moving more towards Malcolm's point of view. The Watts riot on August 11th, 1965, which left 34 dead and 4,000 arrested, with entire city blocks burned to the ground, caught Dr. King and the Southern Freedom Movement completely off guard. Following that, King began to see that, quote, there are literally 2 Americas, one beautiful, rich, and primarily white, and the other ugly, poor, and disproportionately Black. The other America, as he began to call it, helped him to understand something of the world that created Malcolm X. King said to his advisor, Black gay Quaker Bayard Rustin, I've worked to get these people the right to eat hamburgers, and now I've got to do something to help them get the money to buy them. He realized that formal equality didn't mean material conditions of Black Americans would change. So he moved to a more separatist point of view. Each saw the other's point of view clearly. Sadly, although Martin and Malcolm often refer to the other in interviews, they only met once, one time. They were both at the Capitol where the Voting Rights Act was being debated, and they had each held press conferences. And as Dr. King was coming out of one and Malcolm X was coming out of another, Malcolm approached him. The entire exchange only lasted a moment. Well, Malcolm, good to see you. Good to see you, Martin. They walked down the hall as cameras clicked. When you look at those pictures, it's really a haunting moment, a sense of unrealized potential that leaves us wondering what the 2 of them could have accomplished had they lived long enough to complete their evolution. One has a federal holiday, one does not. But they both changed our world for good. We can learn from both of them in today's movements that these are movements, not moments, and that the women's marches happening around the country next Sunday, and the immigration issues that are always on the table before us, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and the continued violence toward young black men by white men in authority, that we have to see that those of us who are white must continue to acknowledge our complicity. We haven't done it so well as a group of people. We didn't do it well in the Civil Rights Day. We have to do it now. We have to acknowledge how we are complicit in the racist structures in which we live. With our white privilege, as I said earlier, it makes it easy to turn a blind eye. But we all need to see how our white privilege and also classism impacts us, whatever race we are. We need to take time to seriously examine our own assumptions about why we strive for justice, or even what we consider justice to be, and how that stems from our own class and race and place in the world. Just as Barbara Walters and Dr. Martin Luther King in Anne Frank led very different lives based on where their class and race and place in their world was. If we are truly to honor the lives of these two men, we need to continue the work they began, both by reaching across the table when appropriate and bluntly calling out when necessary. We need to be open to evolution in our own lives. We need to be willing to have our own cages rattled. Next month, I'm beginning a new experiment here with Dr. Jay Hooper, Ethics Unplugged, an alternative midweek platform that we're collaboratively creating. And it will be much different than what we've come to expect from a Sunday morning platform. We will unapologetically create content that lifts up the voices and experience of the historically underserved. And when I say historically underserved, of course I mean in our nation, but I also mean in our ethical societies. The reality is that the Society for Ethical Culture was founded by a white, cisgendered, heterosexual man of privilege, and that's who it was designed for. And we like it. We like being with folks like us, after all, and we like hearing great speakers about issues of the day. There's nothing wrong with that. It's important for us to be made aware of issues we might not know anything about, if not for the speakers at Sunday Platform, and that will continue. But if we are to be relevant, we must expand our identity to include the historically marginalized. If you're wondering, if you're in a group that's been historically marginalized, here's how you can know. If you have ever known that the election of a person to the office of president or governor might impact your basic human rights, then you're part of an historically underserved community. If you vote for people based on their issues, but know that no matter who gets in office, you're pretty much protected, that means you're not. So women got that loud and clear this past May, didn't we? When the politically charged conservative justices of the Supreme Court overturned the basic human right of having agency over our own bodies and access to abortion. That was because someone in power selected those people to be on that. But that same court, queer people got their own ability to marry legally, and that's also threatened by this same court. Thanks to the marriage, kind of whatever the Marriage Act that they passed that protects marriage equality for queer folk and interracial marriages. Those were all up on the chopping block. Black and brown people get that when states where conservative Republicans won passed voting restriction laws, that their basic human rights as an American citizen is threatened. We live in New York City, one of the most diverse cities in our nation. There are more than 200 languages spoken fluently here by the citizens of this city. It does not speak, as much as we love our traditional Sunday platform, it does not speak to the vast majority of cultures in our fair town. That's not an indictment against you or me. It's an awareness that we need to expand our reach. Don't we want to be the place in Manhattan where folks of all races, ethnicities, and cultures can find an ethical home that speaks in a language they understand? Don't we want to be that place? I want to be that place. And thankfully, it doesn't cost us anything personally to expand that reach. We do live in two Americas, actually more than that, as Martin and Malcolm discovered. And we are called as ethical culturists not to bring people into our America, into Felix Adler's America, but to create a place where all people can live into the fullness of their lives, to demand that America expands its reach to all people, to create a table where there is place for everyone, regardless of beliefs, regardless of race, regardless of gender identity, regardless of age, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of relationship status, regardless of income, regardless of ability, to be fully welcomed and seated at the table, to feast at the banquet and not be left out, as Malcolm felt. To be able to say, I am a diner in the ethical culture society, and I am fed deep, rich food. And so I want to say, I know it's scary for some of you. This change seems scary. It's not anything, it's not an indictment against how we are as ethical society. It's an expansion of it, and I'm proud of you. I'm so proud of you for saying yes to taking this step. I'm proud of you for saying yes to change, to diversity, to exploring the edges of our faith in humankind. And at the end of the day, that's what Martin and Malcolm had, faith in humankind to do better. As we celebrate them both today, I'm so grateful for this ethical society and the fine people here and on Zoom. I'm so grateful that we're saying yes to that faith too. May it be so.